It's 1980. Technology is rapidly expanding. Blondie's Call Me has spent 6 weeks as the #1 song on the Billboard 100. The Shining, Airplane, and the Blues Brothers are in theaters. And Ronald Reagan has just been elected as president. General economic growth and relative stability in the 50s and 60s led Americans to believe they no longer needed social programs. In their minds, the economy was an ever-expanding pie that would benefit everyone. White, blue-collar workers became resentful of affirmative action and social programs built to support women, Black Americans, and other people of color. Preoccupied with their own economic problems, they saw these examples of social reform as unfair. Conservatives capitalized on this by fear-mongering about a supposed national deficit, claiming it could only be reduced by ending so-called irresponsible spending used to create and maintain social programs. White Americans would find their grievances reflected in Ronald Reagan. Reagan and his cabinet were proponents of supply-side economics, an economic theory that claimed major tax breaks for the nation's most wealthy would eventually trickle down in the economy and create a rising tide that would take everyone with it. Naturally, these policies merely led to even more extreme stratification of inequality in the U.S. He satisfied frustrated white Americans by severely cutting programs dedicated to social justice that they deemed unfair. His devotion to deregulation and slashing of public programs would damage welfare benefits and its recipients for decades. Future administrations would struggle to return power to the wounded social programs that Reagan had cut. Reagan solidified conservative Republicans' relationship with evangelical Christianity through their marriage with Jerry Falwell's moral majority. This relationship would gain them major voter support in traditionally middle-of-the-ground populations like blue-collar whites and Northern Catholics. Reagan popularized the concept of the welfare queen, an imaginary figure still summoned today to represent a woman who had enriched herself by taking advantage of various social programs. While the original story he capitalized on was proven to be false, and no corroborating or evidence has ever been confirmed, politicians and talking heads still invoke her imagery today as an example of welfare's irresponsibility and the excess afforded to undeserving individuals. Reagan combined severe budget cuts with sweeping tax cuts, primarily focused on the nation's wealthiest. While Reagan met strong political resistance when attempting to cut Social Security or Medicare, other social programs were primed for the chopping block. Reagan cut the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, by nearly 18%, removing 400,000 needy families from the rolls. He cut food stamps by nearly 15%, cutting 1 million hungry people from eligibility. He cut funding for low-income housing by a staggering 60%. In order to restrict Medicare without risking political harm, Reagan and his administration prepaid hospitals for Medicare recipients' care. This fee would not increase, regardless if the patient needed to stay longer, or if they required advanced care. This encouraged hospitals to discharge patients early, or serve only those who were unlikely to develop complications, such as wealthier patients who had always had access to preventative care. Through all of this, the 400 wealthiest Americans saw their wealth triple. Perhaps one of the most disastrous effects of Reagan's presidency was his mishandling, or malicious disregard, of the AIDS epidemic. While AIDS wreaked havoc across the country, infecting over 1 million people by '92 and killing nearly 140,000 people in a decade. American conservatives, emboldened by the Reagan administration, considered this as God's will and lobbied against federal funding to assist in preventing or treating the disease. The federal government cut funding for the AIDS epidemic, refused to invest in safe-sex education, denied approval for needle exchange clinics, and attempted to make AIDS diagnoses public knowledge, thus endangering individuals whose identities may put them at risk in their communities. With proper funding, treatment, awareness, and empathy, it's possible that hundreds of thousands of lives would have been spared. The conservative era in the United States has been disastrous for minorities, women, poor people, veterans, the elderly, and practically every form of vulnerable population. We have still not recovered from the consequences of the severe social program cuts from Reagan and Bush Sr.'s administrations. Poor people became poorer while the rich got richer. White America was emboldened in their racial resentment and apathy to the other. However, even through this, the social work profession remained remarkably resilient regardless. Despite extreme outside influence, the vast majority of social workers did not become more conservative through the 80s and 90s. They developed political action committees such as PACE, focusing on supporting candidates and politicians who were dedicated to social reform. While the consequences of conservative policy and attacks on social programs persist today, so too do the efforts of social workers and other social justice activists to create a nation that is just for even its most vulnerable members.